Great Britain, the nation which once had the largest overseas empire in the world and invented the steam locomotive. If it weren't for British presence in these colonies, society as we know it would have been vastly different, especially in terms of technological advancement. Even after independence from Great Britain, British way of life still has an impact on American society to this day through legal codes, rock bands, television shows, and railways. Although many people refer to the British invasion as the mass recognition of British bands in the States during the 1960s and 70s, this British invasion will recount the various examples of locomotives that visited America, as well as those which were imported from Britannia from the earliest days of American railroading to present day. When one thinks of British steam locomotives in the United States, the Flying Scotsman USA tour is usually the first thing that comes to mind. Here, Britain's most famous steam locomotive was shipped from its home country all the way to the United States for a 4-year-long transcontinental tour in 1969 and almost didn't return home. Of course, not every aspect of American railroading is identical to its British counterpart, and modifications were made to the steam engine in order to meet safety standards, including a cowcatcher, bell, USRA couplers, front headlight, and a whistle. What fewer people know, however, is that two similar tours occurred in the US 3 decades prior with the Flying Scotsman rival railroad, the London Midland Scottish, or LMS. Their first such tour was with Royal Scot class number 6152 King's Dragoon Guardsmen, renumbered to 6100 Royal Scot in 1933 for the Chicago Century Progress Fair, where the engine traversed Canada and the US with a distance roughly twice the size in about half the time when compared to the Scotsman's tour. The second tour was only 6 years later, where Princess Coronation class number 6229 Duchess of Hamilton was renumbered and renamed as 6220 Coronation for the 1939 New York's World Fair, where it famously raced the Baltimore and Ohio Royal Blue Streamliner. However, the outbreak of the Second World War delayed the return of the Princess Coronation until 1943, where it was given its original name and number back. But the carriages from the tour train, however, did not return to Britain and were instead placed onto a siding and used as accommodation for U.S. Army personnel. Thankfully, both LMS engines survive in preservation, as 6100 is currently pulling excursions throughout Britain as one of 2 remaining rebuilt Royal Scot classes, while Duchess of Hamilton is on static display as one of 3 remaining Coronation classes and the only one in its streamlined form at the National Railway Museum in York. Art and publicity stunts. Some British engines have briefly found themselves in the hands of American railway museums, with 2 of these engines being found in the humble origins of Steamtown, USA, also known as Belle Falls, Vermont at the time. The 2 locomotives in question are Southern Railway Schools class number 926 Repton and London South Western Railway M7 class number 30053. Repton was originally going to be purchased by the Empire State Railway Museum in Middletown, New York, but it was ultimately purchased by Steamtown in 1966 along with 30053, where the 2 engines sat as static displays. Of the 2 engines, Repton was more well known by American rail fans since it was loaned to the Cape Breton Steam Railway in Canada a few years later, where it was modified to American standards and pulled excursion trains, and was later sent back to Steamtown when they moved to its current location in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Eventually, unhappy about the poor condition of LSWR 53, a group known as the Southern Repatriation Group was formed with the aim of returning the 2 Southern steam engines to their home country, as 53 was transported in 1987 to the Swanage Railway, where it was later restored and remains to this day. 2 years later, Repton was returned to Great Britain in much better condition as it was purchased by the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, where it continues to work to this day. In addition to these 2 Southern steam engines staying in the States for 2 decades, a few more lesser-known British locomotives will make a brief appearance at another well-known railway museum, this time in Sacramento, California. Of the visiting steam engines, the one with the most history on North America was Dunrobin, a private engine for the Duke of Sutherland, which was sold to the Fort Steele Heritage Village in British Columbia in 1965 and made an appearance at Vancouver Expo 86 before Rail Fair 91. The engine would be brought back to Fort Steele after the event in Sacramento until being shipped back to Britain in 2011, where it's currently preserved at the Beamish Museum. But back to the Rail Fair, the other British visitors include a Great Northern Railway J13 class number 1247, Locomotion number 1, built by Robert Stephenson, and reportedly BR Standard Class 8 Duke of Gloucester, although the plans for this engine were likely cancelled as there are no known photos of the engine in the States. Other British engines that visited the US for similar rail-related exhibitions include L&WR Greater Britain class Queen Empress for the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, as well as Richard Trevettig's Newcastle locomotive, and Great Western King class King George V at the Baltimore and Ohio Centennial Fair of the Iron Horse at Baltimore in 1926. The last of these impressed the state so much that it would directly inspire the Baltimore and Ohio Lord Baltimore, as well as a few other locomotive classes produced by the Montclair shops around the same time, particularly with the design of the smoke box door, smooth boiler, and an experimental water tube firebox. Not every steam locomotive that came from Britain returned, however. After spending some time at Rail Fair 91, John Knowles Company's Gwen, a narrow-gauge steam locomotive, not only attended the next rail fair at the same location 8 years later, but was also sold to a private collector in the same state. As a matter of fact, this engine was sold in an auction all the way back in 1958. After the Sandhutton Light Railway in England shut down, it was owned by 4 different people in the US and has remained on a private backyard railway in Northbridge, California since 1983. Yet, Gwen wasn't the only little British engine to stay in the States, as an 060 tank engine would be purchased by a small Michigan short line for tourist runs. Originally built as RCH 7745, or Medford No. 2, the power plant shunter was acquired in 1970 along with 3 British Rail Mark I coaches by the Boyne City Railroad for service on the newly established tourist runs between Boyne City and Boyne Falls, Michigan. Once in the US, Medford 2 was repainted in a BR green-inspired livery and was named the Flying Duchess, as it pulled the 3 Mark I coaches until the line's closure in 1978. 2 years later, the Flying Duchess was sold to the Tennessee Valley Railway Museum, where it pulled museum trains for some time before being sold to a scrap dealer in Louisville, Kentucky for years, but was rescued by the Ohio Valley Historical Foundation, who placed it on static display at LaGrange, Kentucky, and eventually gave it an enhanced livery and a horn what the heck which pays homage to its BR green of the Boyne City Railroad. But while the Flying Duchess was spending time between owners in the US, a new concept in British railcar design was being tested around the world. The beginning of the infamous Pacer railbus family was brought forth by numerous variants of the single-car Leyland Pacer railbus, which was the most essential form of the Pacer's definition, a singular Leyland bus on a freight wagon frame. Although many of these rail buses tested throughout the US for service expansion were used by existing commuter roads, one of these railcars, specifically LEV-2, the only one to be built by Wickham instead of BREL, stayed in the US as it was purchased by Amtrak for testing on the Northeast Corridor. However, a grade crossing accident would render the Pacer inoperable as it was sold to Steamtown, who also rendered the railcar inoperable as it was sold again to the Durban and Greenbrier Valley Railroad, who later sold it to the Connecticut Trolley Museum, where it was finally scrapped in 2021. Although, not every British engine that stayed in the States was some small, obscure steam locomotive or railcar, as 2 of the 6 remaining LNER A4 class locomotives survive in North America. One of the 2, specifically number 4496, was renamed from Golden Shuttle to Dwight D. Eisenhower after World War II in honor of the American general, and was donated to the same country Eisenhower served soon after it was retired in 1963, specifically to the National Railroad Museum near Green Bay, Wisconsin. Similarly, although not in the US, number 4489 Dominion of Canada was donated to its namesake nation at the Canadian Railway Museum near Montreal 3 years later, where both engines have remained ever since, with the exception of a brief visit to the National Railway Museum in York, England for the 75th anniversary of Mallard's run in 2013, before being sent back to their respective museums the next year. Since locomotives are a British invention, it should come as no surprise that some of America's first engines were imported directly from the inventors. This also includes the first engine on American soil, namely the Pride of Newcastle, which was fittingly renamed to America. The engine, designed by Robert Stephenson, arrived in New York in January 1829 for service on the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad to connect coal mines to the Delaware and Hudson Canal between Carbondale and Honesdale, Pennsylvania, thus being America's first railroad. Although America was the nation's first locomotive in an order of 4 engines, the next engine to arrive, Stourbridge Lion, would be much more well known, as America would suffer a boiler explosion in July of 1829, while the railroad opened a month later on August 8, 1829, with Stourbridge Lion pulling the first train. Although 2 more engines from Foster, Rastrick & Company would arrive later in the year, specifically the Delaware and the Hudson, Trials for the line were unsuccessful since the engine weighed almost twice the 4-ton weight limit on the line, and the 4 engines were eventually used for parts. But the boiler of the Stallbridge line remains at the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore, and a complete replica of the engine is kept at the Wayne County Historical Society Museum at the engine's hometown of Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Although the first engine in America was built by Robert Stephenson, it wasn't the last one he would build for the States, as he built 2 more small engines for the Boston and Providence Railroad, specifically another engine named America, and the second one being named Whistler. Likewise, his local competition in Britain, specifically Braithwaite and Ericsson, which manufactured Novelty, would also compete in the American market, as B&E would produce 14 locomotives for various railroads in the States, including the Mississippi in 1834, which is preserved as the first locomotive to run in its namesake state. Yet Stephenson would not be outdone as he built another icon in early steam American locomotives in 1831, when the John Bull was constructed for the Camden and Amboy Railroad in New Jersey, where it operated for over 30 years and was heavily modified to gain what would be a truly American look, particularly with a cab, leading truck, cowcatcher, and wider funnel. Eventually, the John Bull was preserved, showcased, and steamed up on multiple occasions by the railroad's successor, Pennsylvania Railroad, until the engine was acquired by the Smithsonian Institute where, after being steamed up for many world fairs and exhibitions until 1985, it remains preserved in the National Museum of American History at the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Speaking of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the railroad which I named my channel after would roster 2 steam engines imported from Britain. In addition to acquiring the John Bull, the Pennsy would import an experimental 2220 tender engine in 1889 based directly on the LNWR Dreadnought class, number 1320. Yet, since the original builder of the Dreadnought class, the LNWR's Crew Works, was not legally allowed to sell the engine overseas, 1320 was constructed by Bayer, Peacock & Company in Manchester with the same specifications as the Dreadnought. And of course, in typical American fashion, it was given a large front headlight, a cowcatcher, and a bell. The idea of the engine's wheel arrangement was that different cylinders would be driving different leading wheels, but 1320 was slow and weak when compared to the Pensy's other, domestically purchased locomotives, which wasn't helped by the relatively small British engine being unsuited to the rougher trackage. Furthermore, the unique design of the cylinders made the locomotive difficult to operate and maintain, making it unpopular among the road's engineers and management staff, as the locomotive was scrapped in 1897. For over a century, this was the last directly imported British locomotive to see service in the States. That is until August 2021, when Carnegie Mellon University imported 2 Viva Rail D trains on the East Broad Top Railroad. Under this program, London Underground D78 stock subway cars are converted into battery-powered multiple units branded as the D train, or Class 230, and after seeing success on regional lines in Britain, a 2-car set was purchased by Railroad Development Corporation in the US for similar low-density service called Pop-Up Metro. Even though the railcars are currently testing on a heritage railroad at the moment, many commuter agencies and private sector real estate companies have expressed interest in the Pop-Up Metro concept, as the use of these converted subway cars is looking to revive the once expansive branch line passenger service of the United States. As the nation which created the locomotive, it should come as no surprise that the legacy of the British has left its mark on railroading not only in the former colony of America, but also around the world. Even though the massive size and overall design of American engines starkly contrast the quaint sides of the British, most cultures visited and inspired each other on at least a few occasions, with many American designs going to Great Britain as well. Even centuries after British engineering helped create the first American railways, their emerging technology and locomotive design still impacts the States to this day, as British multiple units such as the BR Class 800 are often discussed for various American commuter and intercity rail proposals, albeit some of these MUs aren't made by British companies themselves. Regardless, it's through all of the exhibitions, demonstration runs, and imports of British engines by American railroads that allowed a greater understanding of not only locomotive design, but also each other's overall standards and customs. Thank you all for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.